Welcome to the Covenant Podcast. The Covenant Podcast is brought to you by Covenant Baptist Theological Seminary and exists to equip listeners with theological content from a 1689 Baptist perspective. My name is Dewey Doval. I'm one of the pastors of Emmanuel Reformed Baptist Church in SeaTac, Washington. And today I have the privilege of welcoming Keith Foskey onto our program to discuss the subject of Christian humor. Keith, welcome to the Covenant Podcast, brother. It is a delight to have you join us today.
Well, thank you, Dewey. I appreciate you having me on and for Austin setting this up and being able to come on and talk to you, gentlemen. Thank you.
Absolutely. It's not every day that we have the opportunity to see a studio like yours. Really appreciate that. If you're listening, I'd encourage you to go check out the YouTube video because you're not going to want to miss Keith's really cool setup there in his recording studio. And as I mentioned to Keith off the camera, off of our recording, that I am not even that familiar with his life and ministry. And so this first question, Keith, that I offer to you is really just as much for me as it is to our listeners. Would you be willing to just kind of give us a flyover sketch of your personal background, your family, your ministry, and anything else you'd like to let our listeners know about yourself?
Sure. Well, you mentioned the studio, so let me start there. This is the studio for my podcast, which is it's called YourCalvinist Podcast with Keith Foskey. And this is actually, it's joking. It looks nice, but it's actually a 10 by 12 metal shed. We call it the Theo shed. And it sits right outside of my house. We had it spray foam insulated and put all the sound baffling in, and now we get to use it as a podcasting studio. But I also, the most important thing outside of being a husband and father is that I'm the pastor of Sovereign Grace Family Church, which is a Baptist church in Jacksonville, Florida. I've been the pastor there. This is my 19th year, going into my 19th year as pastor of Sovereign Grace. And I have seen the church go from not a Reformed, not a Calvinistic church, but to see it go through periods of revival and see God move. And we now are a Baptist church by confession, but we hold to the First London Confession, which is, I've done podcasts on why, but that's a whole other conversation. But we are a Baptist church in Jacksonville, Florida. And as I said, I've been here for quite a while. I have a wife and 6 children. My daughter's about to be married soon. So in fact, within the next few weeks. So I'm excited about that. Our oldest daughter is being married. And I also do comedy, which seems like an odd mix, but I started doing humorous videos online, particularly videos that make fun of denominational distinctives. So people who have seen like the denominations go to the gun range, or the denominations do martial arts, or the denominations, this is me playing the different parts of, you have the Methodist who is a little dainty, you have the Presbyterian who's holding the big cigar, these different characters that I've created that model and in a fun way mock the different denominations. And so have built that into somewhat of a fun channel on YouTube. And I would say the vast majority of people who find me through the humor, but they also find that we have a very serious and theological podcast. And so people say they come for the funny and stay for the serious. And I'm thankful to hear that. That's not something I came up with. That's just, I've heard enough people say it that it's sort of become our unofficial tagline. And so humor for us is used as a tool to get people to check out what we're doing. And we use it in a way to hopefully glorify God.
Well, that's very interesting, Keith. And I'm not a very funny guy, which is why we typically don't do a whole lot of banter on our show. Austin and I wouldn't know what to start with or what jokes to crack. And it would just go really, really miserably for us if we tried something along those lines. So we kind of, start with the serious, stay with the serious, I guess could be our tagline here on the Covenant Podcast. But, you mentioned there at the end of your answer, wanting to glorify God through an appropriate use of humor and using that as a tool to at least get a audience, perhaps, with those who come into contact with your work online. In your estimation, what are some of the possible ways that humor could be abused? Because we do know that it can be abused, like all good things can be. How would you draw a distinction between, appropriate expressions of humor versus like an abuse of humor?
The first way humor can be abused, I think, would be when a pastor thinks that the pulpit is a nightclub and the microphone is his stage, or the stage is a nightclub, the pulpit is his comedy time.
Mm-hmm.
And I know a lot of pastors who just constantly try to riff and make jokes and try to make things so personal. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to create a personal connection with the audience,
Right.
that they leave out anything meaningful, and they don't deal with the serious issues. They don't preach truth. They instead try to preach only with humor. And so I think the first thing is to use humor in the wrong context. There are times when we can be humorous, and we should. And I think there are times where humor has a very powerful is a very powerful tool in the hands of someone who wields it correctly, just like a weapon or a firearm or a sword can be a dangerous thing, or it can be a useful thing. It just has to be in the hands of the right person at the right time. In the same way, it can be a dangerous thing. If you give a child a gun, if you give a fool a sword, then you don't know what's going to happen. And that's what I see as one of the potential dangers in humor, is just contextually inaccurate times of use. And the pulpit is certainly not a place for a comedian, which sounds ironic because I am a comedian. But what I mean is, it's not the place for the comic to be a comic. Something else, I think humor that is crude. Yes, when is it's wrong. I mean, obviously, all of my humor is very clean. I do think that there are times where we can push the envelope a little to make a point, and maybe we'll talk about this in a little while when we start talking about some of the ways humor is powerful. Is sometimes humor is one of the ways that we address really difficult subjects, and we do it in a way that is pointed and sometimes even a little on the line. But I think those who go over the line to be funny, and again, going back to the pulpit, I know I've heard of pastors who just tell the worst stories that because they think it's going to be funny, or they say something totally outlandish because they think it's going to be funny. A real good example, very recently, there was a female bishop or something in an Episcopal church, where she shouldn't even been in the pulpit anyway. But she used a curse word in regard to something. It was something about Donald Trump, and she's just going off about or Christian, like Christian. Oh, it was Christ the King Sunday, and apparently in the liturgical calendar, this is like a special Sunday where the kingship of Christ is celebrated. And she says, we're not going to do that because that brings a military view of Christ, and that military view of Christ is and she used a cuss word about it, and everybody just they like clapping seals, just kind of had this real happy, oh, she said a bad word, we're happy. And she smiled afterwards and kind of giggled about it, like it's like, yeah, but you did it to be funny, you did it to get attention, you got attention because it went viral. But that's one of the times when I would say, yeah, not cool, not a good use of humor. So those are just a few thoughts on bad ways to use humor. And I guess one third one, because I'm a Baptist, I have to give everything 3 points.
That's right.
The third one would be the intentional hurt, intentional for no other reason than just to hurt. I sometimes will really poke at Methodists, and some people have said that I'm overly mean to Methodists, and I joke back and I say, well, they deserve it. But but the reality is, most of the Methodists that I know that have seen some of the humor that I've done understand I'm not poking at the individual. I'm poking at the ridiculousness of what's happening. Like, for instance, last year there was the United Methodists had their national conference. I don't know what it's called, convention conference or whatever. And everyone who came up to the podium had to announce themselves along with their pronouns. And some of them were just these ridiculously long expressions of, my name is Jim Smith and my pronouns are he, she, him, hop, like, and it was like this long thing. And so I made a video where I pretended to be there. Like, I made a podium that looked like the podium that was there. And I made a video of me walking up and giving my pronouns. And it was like, my pronouns are His Royal Highness, and I demand that everyone call me that. So that was like my joking against that. So I'm not poking at the individuals as much as I am poking at the ridiculousness of what has been allowed. And so I think there is a sense in which humor can be abusive and bullyish, and I wouldn't want to do that. And I think that's wrong. But I do think, again, it can be a very useful lever to wrench against foolishness. Some of the best ways to demonstrate foolishness is just to simply say, here's what it looks like, because this is what you're doing. You're being foolish, and you mirror that back. And it's like, okay, this is obviously foolish.
That's very well said. It's answering the fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. That's a very good mindset to have. It's biblical, and it's also very practical. And you mentioned there is practical value. You alluded to it. There's practical value in humor. There's benefits to humor. There's powerful ways of emphasizing a teaching point or a principle through humor. Share with us some of the blessings, benefits, value that comes with a good, dare I say, Christian expression of humor.
Last year, I was invited to a men's meeting, and I'm only telling this because this is part of how I'm going to answer your question. Last year, I was invited to a men's meeting at a church in Pensacola, Florida. And I was asked to speak to a group of 80 men on the subject of humor in the Christian life. What's the value of humor in the Christian life? And because I'm a pastor first, my first thought is, I'm not going to preach a sermon, but I still want to have a text that I start with, right? Like a text that I build this truth on, because it's not just anecdotal, it's biblical. And so there's the passage in the Old Testament that says, a merry heart doeth good like a medicine, but a broken spirit dries the bones. And that's a Hebrew parallelism. And obviously there's a parallel between a merry heart and a broken spirit. There's a parallel between does good like a medicine and dries the bones. And so I talked a little bit about how that particular passage functions in teaching something about the difference between a merry heart and a broken spirit. I talked about friends that I knew who had gone through times of genuine brokenness and genuine despair. Some very close friends of mine who had lost children or had gone through other times of grief and pain. And I talked about that being a time in their life where it was absolutely just filled with grief and brokenness and seemed like there was no joy, no happiness. And then I talked about how there are times where a little bit of levity, a little bit of humor, not being foolish or crass, but a little bit of humor in moments like that can be very, very much a salve on a cut or a brace to a broken bone or something. And so I gave that example. And so I said, a merry heart does good like a medicine. I even cited some medical journals that talked about the value of those who go through times of cancer treatments and other things. If they keep an attitude that is positive and happy versus an attitude of being just absolutely miserable, that it actually increased their health and made them not only feel better, but even recover more quickly and things like that. And so it's not just that it makes you feel better, but it actually sort of makes you better. Like it, and so I talked about the value of humor from just a purely physical and spiritual and mental aspect, that it does good to have a part of us that enjoys to laugh. And you said you're not very funny, but I'm sure when you're with your family that there's time. I heard you had children before we came in.
Yeah.
I mean, you have children in the next room. I'm sure there are times where you laugh with your children and you laugh with your wife. And even if it's over things that nobody else would think is funny, no, you don't have to be a comedian, but there are times where laughter filling the home and laughter filling our hearts just feels good. And so there's that positive side of humor that it strengthens us for the next battle, because we can't always laugh. Ecclesiastes says there's a time to laugh and a time to mourn, right? We're not always going to laugh. And so the times of laughter prepare us for the times of mourning. They give us strength for the day. And so that's one of the ways that I think humor has a lot of value in the Christian life. Another way, again, walking through these sort of in my mind, is that humor is, and I alluded to this earlier, but I'm going to expand a little bit more on it now. It is one of the most powerful tools for engaging the world with the truths of God. And I'm gonna sorry for coughing, excuse me.
No worries.
But I'll give you an example from the world, and then show it, and then try to show how like it would be for us. Okay. The most influential and listened to and even trusted news figure among young people in the last 20 years has been Jon Stewart. Do you know who Jon Stewart is?
I don't, but that's not saying anything.
No, it's okay. It's okay. I would be curious if your audience would disagree with me, because Jon Stewart is the host of The Daily Show, which is a Comedy Central news show. But he engages with the news, real news, but he does so in a way that is funny. Now, people who hate him would say he's not funny. And again, I disagree with 90% of the things that he says, but I think he's funny. I disagree with him, but I think he's got comedic timing. He's a professional comedian. He knows how to take important subjects and present it in such a way that make you not only laugh, but listen. And so people between the ages of 18 and 24, that very interesting demographic that has so much power when it comes to how things are marketed, how things are sold. 18 to 24 demographic is huge, right? That's the college age. That's the one that all the people who sell things are pushing to that demographic, right? Because they're the consumers. They're the next generation of consumers, because they're getting older. And so this particular, looking at him, and I as a pastor, I look back and I say, okay, this guy has the ear of a generation of people. People listen to him. Why are they listening to him? They're listening to him because he's taking things that are important, but he's giving it to them in a way that is humorous and understandable and digestible. And so I look at that and I say, okay, then there is certainly a way in which humor allows for us to convey information in a way that is unique. Here's real quick. If you said, now this is going to be different for you, Daryl or Dewey, I'm sorry, but you'd probably have no trouble listening to an hour and a half sermon, right? Because you're a unique young man. But if you said to the average person, hey, we're going to go listen to a sermon, it's going to take an hour and a half, the average person would be like, that's a long time, right? But if you said to the person, we're going to go to a comedy show and it's going to last 3 hours, they'd be like, okay. I mean, it really would. It would be no problem. And the dynamic is similar. You got one guy on a platform speaking into a microphone, right? The dynamic is different in the sense that they're doing two different things. Preaching is not comedy, and I made that point earlier. But if you said to somebody, you're going to sit and listen to John MacArthur for 3 hours, a lot of young people are like, that's tough. If you said, I'm going to go listen to I'm only going to use this name. I know he's crass, but I'm only going to use this name because people would know Dave Chappelle. I was like, well, I'll go listen to Dave Chappelle for 3 hours. I'm like, I'm on board, right? They're going to go. And that doesn't make it right. And I'm not arguing for the righteousness of it. I'm just saying it is what it is, right? When we look at comedy and its ability to convey truth and convey information. And now I'm going to wrap that up with another thing that comedy does that sometimes straight can't do. And when I say straight, I don't mean like straight versus gay. I mean like straight, like in the sense of, the straight man versus the comedian.
Right.
And this is not something I came up with. This is a very famous pastor. I'll leave his name out. But this was something that he said, and it just stuck with me when he said it, because it was profound. He said, imagine you were faced with someone who was arguing for, let's just say they were arguing for the pronoun debate, right? And they came to they came into your life and they said, I'm going to demand that you identify me as a 16-year-old Chinese girl, even though I'm an 80-year-old, Caucasian man, right? Like I'm going to demand that you do this. You can handle that in one of two ways. You can either give a well-articulated, well-spoken defense for the righteousness of not using pronouns, which would be tantamount to lying. You could give a righteous defense and really make a case for all of these things that are true. Or you could just look him in the face and say, I don't think so, Skippy. And like that be it. Like I'm not going to play your game. I don't think so, Skippy. You don't get to set the rules here. And not only is it funny, but it's in one sentence what an hour of, sort of making your case. It's all in one sentence. I don't think so, Skippy. We're not doing that. So humor has an ability to cut through the nonsense and just get right to the point. I'm not doing what you're asking me to do something. I'm not going to do it. So that's just a few ways that I think humor can be valuable.
No, those are very helpful, Keith. I appreciate you sharing that with me and with our listeners. I think about the majority of the people who are probably listening to this episode. They're current pastors, they're aspiring pastors in seminary. There probably are some people who are really gifted with humor, may even be able to incorporate humor into their preaching or into their life in general in a way that balances a sobriety and a seriousness on the one hand, with also just a jovial and laid back personality on the other hand. But I would also imagine there's many who really struggle with, how do I find that balance? How do I model that? And really, what does that even look like practically? So I wonder, you mentioned that you're a Baptist, you got to have your 3 points. Maybe you have some applications or principles. It can be 3, it can be 5, it can be 1, perhaps, whatever you're led to share here with our listeners. But are there any principles or guidelines for how our listeners can strike that appropriate balance between enjoying the blessings of Christian humor, but also not allowing their expression of humor to cause them to lose the sobriety and seriousness that we're called to emulate throughout our Christian life, or even throughout our ministry for those who are in ministry?
Sure. That's a terrific question. And my answer is going to be somewhat simple, but I think hopefully at least have a modicum of profundity. Listen to the generation who came before you. And here's what I mean. What are the things you remember most about R.C. Sproul? What are the things you remember most about Voddie Baucham? What are the things you remember most about John MacArthur? Now, I only mentioned those 3 names. I know that's 3 vastly different theological perspectives. You got a Presbyterian, a 1689 Baptist, and a dispensational Calvinist. But at the same time, if you listen to those men for any length of time, and I have listened to both of them, or all three of them, dozens of hours, if not hundreds of hours of their sermons. And one of the things that I've always been very moved by, particularly with Sproul, is the interjection of the personal, and oftentimes the humorous interjections that are in his sermons, because they're connection points. And that's, I mean, what's the one thing everybody remembers about Sproul? What's wrong with you people? Right? Like, were you going to say that?
Yeah, I just said that. Yeah.
I always say this when I was there when he said it. I was in the audience. It was in Orlando, Florida, when he said, "What's wrong with you people?" I looked at my wife. I said, "That's going to live forever." I said, "It's going to live forever, not just because, he got a little hot under the collar. It's going to live forever because that's hilarious." That's a hilarious answer to that question. Is what is wrong with you that you would even ask this question? Like, they say there's no stupid questions. Au contraire. and so that's, and Vody, like, if I said, that dog won't hunt, if you can't say amen, say ouch, right? These are things that he says. He peppers these into all of his messages. And I don't care when you listen to him, whether it's 10 years ago or 10 minutes ago, when he says, if you can't say amen, say ouch, people giggle. When he says that dog won't hunt, people laugh. Even if they've heard him say it 100 times, it's become a tagline. He could put it on a t-shirt and sell it. He probably won't. I would, but he probably won't. And so that's it, right? It created almost something to expect. And MacArthur is less so, but I'm finding the more I listen to him, I find little pepperings of connection points with his audience that are really great. And I don't know if you ever saw this, but there was one time where Sproul, toward the end of his life, was attending a conference via video. It was a conference. I think it was at Masters or at Grace Community Church, and Sproul was on video. Because
it may have been strange. I think it might have been the Strange Fire Conference, actually. I remember that, but
might have. Well, they had the audience asking questions, and MacArthur lines up to ask a question. This is on YouTube. People can look it up, MacArthur. And when he walks up to the podium, you can see it in his face. He's so happy because he knows that he's making it fun. He knows at this moment, and he asks a question, and Sproul gets to play, a little gag with him back and forth. And that's the thing people remember. I mean, if you can make truth fun, man, it'll live forever. And so, so that's my thing. Look at your ancestors, the people who came before you. I have to think the Puritans had a sense of humor. I just have to think so, right? Like you don't necessarily catch a lot of it in their writing, but I have to believe that there was at least an understanding of the value of laughter and connecting with people on that level. So that would be my encouragement is, you're not a comedian. And if you're not given to comedic, banter or anything like that, don't force it, because then it's real bad. Then you're in dad joke territory, which is the worst, like the worst kind of humor, unless you're literally doing dad jokes with your kids. So just be yourself and, use humor appropriately. Don't try to force it. But if you're a naturally funny person, also don't try to necessarily not be yourself because you think you have to be so stoic in the pulpit because you have to impress the audience with your demure behavior. No, just be yourself. God made you the way he made you to use you how he wants to use you. So consider that when you're preparing and when you're preaching.
Amen, brother. That's excellent advice. And as we wrap up our conversation today on Christian humor, Keith, you mentioned some of what you're involved with by way of introduction, but I want to give you the opportunity for our listeners who may be interested in listening to some of your content or finding some of the resources that you have online. Are there any specific ones that you think give a one-stop shop for what they can expect kind of as the corpus of your ministry of comedy, or maybe even sermons as well. And then any final thoughts that you'd like to share on this subject that we've been talking about today.
Well, since this one is aimed at pastors, I'm going to give one that I don't normally give.
Okay.
But the first one always is just my website, keithfoskey.com. You can see all the humor stuff. You can see connections for if you want to hear my sermons or anything like that. It's all there. Just keithfoskey.com. A very nice man in the UK built the website for me as a gift, and it's pretty well done. So Fellowship Studios, I always like give them a shout out. They did a very good job. So keithfoskey.com, you can go there. But the other thing is I have a very unique way of doing my sermon notes. And this is another thing, because you've probably never seen it, but a lot of people online have asked me how I do my notes. And it's become sort of a thing where I've helped coach people on how to put their sermons on one page. And it's not just like 3 points on a page. It's literally an entire sermon, but I do it as a graph, and it's really neat. And a lot of people really like it. So if anybody's interested in that, they can just look up Keith's Colorful Sermon Notes. That's literally what it's called on YouTube. And if you're a pastor who's maybe looking for a way to reduce the amount of notes you take into the pulpit, but not go totally noteless, this is a method that I'm trying to help people who want to be able to adapt. And again, it's I used to take 12 to 15 pages into the pulpit, and now I take one. Wow. And it really has revolutionized the freedom that I have in preaching, but not taken away from the quality of my preaching. So that's just a helpful tool that I like to point to people to. And if anybody has any questions for me, they can email me through my website if they want to dig deeper into that question.
Well, thank you, Keith, for those resource recommendations and just for taking the time to spend with us on the Covenant podcast. I'm really excited to check out some of your work after we sign off, and I trust the Lord will continue to bless your labors inside and outside of the local church. So thank you for joining us, and may the Lord bless you richly in the months and years that come.
Well, thank you, I appreciate it very much. God bless you.
Amen. And to our listeners, we want to thank you for your continued support of the Covenant podcast. Until next time, we wish you grace and peace. God bless.